Okay, so we looked at the pre-scientific, scientific, post-scientific periods in the history of psychology. Now we're going to talk about the last one. We can say last one before we move on to the current perspectives. And let's call this the modern period. Well, there are several perspectives or at this time, but the most prevalent ones and most influential ones are the ones we're going to talk about, which are the behaviorism, Gestalt, psychoanalysis, and cognitive perspective. Keep in mind that the time period of modern era was, you can say, mid or early 90s to current. Yeah. Just in late 19th century or 1870s and 80s, as you have seen, structuralism was very popular, and that was the first school of thought. And other schools came as an alternative to this prominent structuralism. The idea was that the opposition to the structuralism was mainly because of the methodology that the Wundt adopted, which was introspection. And the idea then was that introspection cannot be an objective way of studying human behavior. People started calling at that time whoever was interested in mental processes as a mentalist. So the idea was completely out of the traditional psychologists, and people were more interested in non-mental mentalist constructs. So one such alternative to structuralism was behaviorism, and was founded by Watson, and you can say 1900s, 1913 to be specific because of the book he wrote. But again, we'll talk more about this in chapter 5 when we talk about classical conditioning. Now, the idea here is, again, keep in mind, behaviorism was motivated by the idea of only studying things that you can observe objectively, and Watson was more influenced by Pavlov's conditioning, and we'll talk more about this in classical conditioning. And then the idea, if you remember, from the dog, the bell, and the food. So we learn things through association. It's learning via association. And then we can observe the learned behavior, and it's not a mentalist construct. So that was the idea of behaviorism. Watson's idea was to actually make psychology a science of true external behavior. And you can see the influence of Aristotle here, who talks about the importance of objective observations is key to understanding or gaining knowledge about nature, including humans. While Watson actually founded behaviorism, the credit of popularizing it goes to B.F. Skinner, who's known for his Skinner box. The idea is that while Watson was influenced by Pavlov's classical conditioning, Skinner is known for the operant conditioning. It's about rewards and punishment. You can teach any organism, including humans, to repeat a behavior by rewarding it, and through punishments. So he was able to actually teach these pigeons and rats complex behaviors through changes in the environment. And you can go back to the Confucius idea of how environment controls one's behavior here. And if you change an environment in such a way that an accepted or needed behavior is rewarded, and accepted or unneeded behavior is punished, then you can kind of change the human behavior. And these rewards reinforce or strengthen a behavior, and punishments will weaken behavior. And again, we'll talk more about this in chapter 5. So there was one field. Now, parallelly at that time, especially in Germany, there was another a school of thought called Gestalt. Then Wertheimer is known for this school of thought called Gestalt psychology. Again, keep in mind, this again came as an alternative to structuralism, where structuralists were interested in studying the structure of the conscious experience, right? What Wertheimer thought was that knowing the structure is not dividing the whole into components is not what our mind does. Our mind actually puts together the components to give us an experience that is beyond the individual pieces. So we should study, according to Wertheimer, how mind puts together the components, as opposed to studying how we can break down the components or break down the whole into its components. And specifically, he was interested back, and we'll talk about this later on, but he was intrigued by this apparent motion. Apparent motion is when you feel that there is a motion in an object when there isn't one. For example, let's say you're driving the car, you actually park the car, but you feel like you're moving forward. Only later you realize that it's because the car next to you is actually pulling back, and then you feel like you're moving forward. Now, according to Wertheimer, he was interested in such things. These are illusions, and he said, like, well, these illusions are not tricks. The brain actually is using a strategy to organize otherwise ambiguous information presented to the mind, so it can perceive it better. So according to him, then, that according to this school of thought, the mind assembles things in a way that you can perceive it, but it doesn't break the whole. The well-known phrase here is the whole is greater than its parts. One example, if you look at this picture, if I ask you what you see, typically you say you see three circles, and one straight and the other inverted triangle. In fact, there isn't any triangle here. If you see, there aren't any circles either, truly speaking. Well, you can say, hi, there's like three Pac-Mans, and there are these three more Pac-Man kind of things, but there's literally no real triangle here. But you see the triangle, and the idea here is that your experience of this triangle is greater than its components, which aren't triangles. And understanding how our mind does this is what the topic of the study or topic of the field was of Gestalt psychology. Then coming to the third field, which was popular at that time, around the same time as was behaviorism, was psychoanalysis. And if there is one psychologist who's popular, that would be Sigmund Freud, and he founded what is called as psychoanalysis. Well, he was a physician, so he was a doctor, an Austrian doctor who was interested in treating patients. So according to him, again, we'll talk more about him later, but our mind has two components to it, and one is the conscious, which you're aware of. The other is subconscious, which you're unaware of, and uses the tip of the iceberg analogy to suggest that what you're conscious is only the tip of the iceberg, and which is only 1/7, if I'm not wrong, of the size of the iceberg. The subconscious part that you're unaware of is the rest of the iceberg, which is 6/7 of the actual iceberg, meaning that you're only aware of a part of your mind. There is a lot that you're not aware of. And the another proposition here was that this subconscious actually controls the conscious. And it actually is responsible for our basic instincts. And the basic instincts he was more interested in was sex and aggression. So anything that's conscious can be explained in terms of the basic instincts that are subconscious, specific to sex and aggression. And subconscious controls the conscious, so every conscious act we do or we are aware of basically has some sexual or aggressive motive to it. So our covert behaviors have some ulterior motives specific to sex and aggression. And he was more interested in the idea. He was also interested in the idea that our childhood experiences affect our later behavior. Well, that brings us to the last modern perspective, which is the cognitive perspective. Now, before we talk about cognitive perspective, I just want to give you a bigger picture of, if you look at the structuralism, and let's forget Gestalt for a second here, structuralism, behaviorism, and the last one is the cognitive. And if you look at this picture, it kind of starts with structuralism, right? Then there is this behaviorism. Then the field bounced back with the combined ideas that, like, what is good from structuralism, behaviorism. It took it and incorporated in itself by taking the good in both, by taking what is good in both the perspectives, and develop what is called as cognitive perspective. Now, if you look at this, the main difference between the structural and behaviorism is the topic and the method, right? The topic for structuralist was mental processes in a way, although they might not have termed that as a mental process, but studying something that you can see. For behaviorists, on the other hand, the topic is only observable behavior. And the methodology used was, here it was introspection, and here it is observation. So what cognitive psychology did is it took the things that are good in each. In other words, cognitive psychology studied both external behavior and internal behavior, like structuralists, but they adopted objective ways of observation. Now, you may ask, how can you study something you can't see? Well, you later realize when you talk about cognitive psychology in detail that the invent of computers, the difference of software and hardware, the fact that you cannot see a programming, but still you can create programs that run computers, kind of give this basis to the idea that, well, just because you can't see programming doesn't mean that programming doesn't exist. In other words, just because you can't see the mental activities does not mean that it doesn't exist. We still know and how to create these programs. In other words, we still know how mental process, we can learn about mental processes even though we can't observe them. So the basic assumptions of cognitive perspective are that, well, mental processes do exist. And also that we can objectively study mental processes. These were the two major objections that behaviorists have against structuralists. So what cognitive psychologists say here is that, well, they do exist, and you can actually adopt objective measures to actually study these. And the third assumption of cognitive psychology is that humans, they receive, process, and send information. They use the word informivores. Informivores here, like you can be a herbivore, you eat plants, carnivore, eat animals, omnivore, eat both, right? So similar to that, it's like informivores here, suggesting that we are information seeking and processing organisms, and that's what this IPS is, information processing systems. So, and as you've seen, that these mental processes we'll discuss in detail later, but in the big picture, we looked at a few of those mental processes, such as sensation, attention, perception, and memory.